Okay, without further ado.
So I want you to imagine three actual games and just some of the scenarios that happen in them. The first one is Grand Theft Auto. So in any of the Grand Theft Auto games, you're able to commit murder, you're able to go on killing sprees, you're able to cause widespread chaos. And then in the game God of War, sometimes you're allowed to rip people's heads off. In the game Elden Ring, you can kill many soldiers, even those who aren't going to fight you back and who don't want to fight you back. And also, you can invade the worlds of, various characters and then just murder them. So all of these cases are what we call virtual murder. Um, and now I want you to think, are you doing anything wrong if you play Grand Theft Auto or you play God of War or you play Elden Ring? Well, I think most of us, our intuition is that the answer is no. We don't think that committing these types of acts of virtual murder, are bad. And the reason we don't think they're bad is probably because we think nobody is harmed in these acts. After all, these are just AI-controlled characters. They're NPCs, or non-playable characters. And so nobody gets hurt when we kill them. So we can construct an argument that looks something like this. It says, in virtual murder, no one is harmed. If no one is harmed by an act, then it's morally permissible. So a virtual murder is morally permissible. And that looks, all great. But now I want you to imagine some hypothetical games that are based off of Grand Theft Auto, Elden Ring, and God of War. So in these versions of the games, you're able to perform one extra act. So here's what you can do. In this version of Grand Theft Auto, you can also kidnap little kids and molest them. And similarly, we can imagine that in this God of War game, at some point you're trying to get your way with some other character. So you kidnap their child and also do something, some form of sexual violence on them. And then you can imagine that in Elden Ring, you can be an invader, but you can invade like the houses of families and then kidnap their children and commit all sorts of pedophilic acts with them. Well, I want you to think now, are you willing to play those games? And do you think that playing those games is okay? I think for many of us, the intuition is that no, it's not okay to play games where you're molesting or committing pedophilic acts, towards little children. So our intuitions say that these cases of what we're going to call virtual pedophilia are wrong. The problem is that we seem to be in trouble. And the problem is that it looks like the same justification we offered for committing virtual murder applies in the case of virtual pedophilia. In other words, we can run the following argument. We can say that in virtual pedophilia, no one is harmed. If no one is harmed in an act, it's morally permissible. So virtual pedophilia is morally permissible. And of course, the reason that virtual pedophilia is not harmful is because, in fact, there are no children involved in virtual pedophilia, right? This is just a game, and these are just some graphics. They might look like children, but they're not really children. And in fact, nobody is involved except you and this artificial intelligence and, the game presentation. So this is what produces the dilemma. In specific, the dilemma emerges as a result of three premises that we want to accept all three of them, but we can't. So the three premises are virtual murder is morally permissible, virtual pedophilia is morally impermissible, but now here's the problem. It doesn't look like there's a morally relevant difference between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia. But if there's no morally relevant difference between them, then it can't be that both virtual murder is permissible and virtual pedophilia is impermissible. One of these has got to go. Either both acts are permissible or both acts are not permissible. So that's the dilemma. That's the dilemma that the gamer confronts. Either they have to accept that all of those games that they do play which contain virtual murder are not morally permissible because they're like virtual pedophilia, which is also not morally permissible, or they have to accept that both types of games are morally permissible. So now you have to accept that virtual murder is morally permissible, but also that virtual pedophilia is. neither of these seems or strikes us as a happy outcome. After all, we don't want to get, a huge amount of games banned, and we think that we weren't really doing anything wrong when we played those games. But at the same time, we don't want to legalize or, endorse, games that contain virtual pedophilia. So the question is, what do we do in this case? Well, let's start with a quick clarification. I talked about virtual murder and virtual pedophilia, and now let's just try to define these a little bit more clearly, because I think there are some ambiguities in these definitions. So the way Morgan Luck, who introduces this dilemma, describes it is he says, a player commits an act of virtual murder in those cases where he directs his character to kill another in circumstances that were the game environment actual, the actions of his character would constitute actual murder. So, in other words, the idea is that an act counts as virtual murder just in case in the real world it would have counted as murder. Similarly, an act counts as an act of virtual pedophilia just in case if it had happened in the real world, then we would have just counted it as pedophilia. So virtual murder and virtual pedophilia are defined in relation to the real world. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to set aside some, difficulties. So we're going to set aside cases where it's just ambiguously murder. Think about Pac-Man eating ghosts. Is the Pac-Man murdering the ghosts? Well, it's kind of hard to tell. So we can just put that case aside. We're just going to focus on those games where the murder is really explicit. And to do this, we're going to assume that the character that is virtually, that commits the murder in the game is represented as an adult, that you, the game player, are an adult, and that the character you commit the act against is represented as an adult. Of course, they're controlled by artificial intelligence. So we're also going to put aside cases where you're playing a multiplayer game or a two-player game of some sort, and you're committing these acts. So we're going to just focus on single-player games where you're an adult, where your character is represented as an adult. And then in the case of virtual murder, we're going to assume that the person that you murder is represented as an adult. And in the case of virtual pedophilia, we're going to assume that the AI character is represented as a child. And so hopefully this should clarify what these acts are. It's also worth noting that we're putting aside cases where you might commit like virtual self-defense or virtual war. Take the game Call of Duty. Most of the acts in that game are cases of virtual war, not cases of virtual murder, since war is a particular condition. Okay, so now that we've clarified some of these things, let's take a look at some possible responses to this argument. And remember the three premises that I highlighted, which produce this inconsistency. Well, effectively, what most of the debate has tried to do is to reject premise 3. So in other words, we're trying to reject the idea that there's no morally relevant difference between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia. We're trying to highlight some difference between these cases. So here's a first difference that we might highlight. So this is, in Morgan Luck's article, he's going to go through 5 arguments. I'm just going through these 5 arguments. So the first argument is what he calls social acceptability. Basically, he points out that murder is more socially accepted than pedophilia. And that sounds right, it sounds like we're kind of more comfortable with representations of murder than we are with representations of pedophilia. The problem is that this is not going to help us solve the dilemma, because although it explains why we might be comfortable with one case but not the other, it doesn't show that one of the cases is wrong or that the other case is right. It would show this if we think that acceptability is a good guide to right and wrong. But the problem is that it isn't. And we can see that it isn't because if it were a good guide to right and wrong, then we could think that in the time where sexism was socially acceptable, then it was right to be a sexist at that time. But of course, we don't think this. Similarly, we might think that at a time where slavery was an institution that was socially accepted, then, having a slave would not have been wrong. But of course, we don't think this. So it doesn't look like social acceptability is a good guide to rightness and wrongness. But if it isn't, then this means that the problem has remained as is. It's just wrong. It looks like we've explained why one act is more socially acceptable than the other, but not why one act is more wrong than the other. So let's consider the second argument. The second argument is a significant likelihoods argument, and here's what it says. It says, look, maybe when we commit virtual pedophilia, this makes us more likely to engage in pedophilic acts in the real world. So the idea is that if you perform something in a game, you're more likely to do it in the real world. Now, notice that that's not enough by itself. What we really want to say is that it's not just that virtual pedophilia doesn't lead us to engage in these acts or leads us to engage in these acts, but also that virtual murder doesn't, or at least does so at a lower rate. So the problem would be that if it turns out that doing things in video games makes you do them in the real world, then it looks like virtual murder is equally bad because you don't want people to be more likely to be murderers. So we have to show that on the one hand, virtual pedophilia makes you more likely to engage in these acts, but virtual murder doesn't. You can think of this argument as, in fact, rejecting the first premise that we started with when we talked about virtual pedophilia, which is that in virtual pedophilia, no one is harmed. Here, we're pointing out that somebody is harmed. Kids are harmed, and they're harmed indirectly because performing virtual pedophilia makes you more likely to engage in pedophilic acts. Okay, but so we need to have this asymmetry between the cases. So we need virtual pedophilia to make it more likely, but virtual murder not to. The problem is that none of the empirical data supports this. In fact, none of the empirical data we have supports the idea that if you perform acts in a game, you're more likely to perform them in the real world. Moreover, even if we could find some data to support this, we would still end up with this problem of cathartic uses. So catharsis is like when, you're really sad and then you cry, and that helps you outlet your feeling. The idea of catharsis in video games is something like this. Like imagine somebody has a desire to commit murder, and then they play a game which they can commit virtual murder in, and that operates as a sort of catharsis for them. By committing the virtual murder, they outlet their feelings, and so they don't need to commit the real murder. Similarly, you might think that virtual pedophilia functions in this way. The pedophile is interested in children, but instead of molesting any children, they just play this virtual pedophilia game, and this helps them outlet their feelings. Well, if we go with the justification that we've just been giving, then it looks like sometimes virtual murder and virtual pedophilia will actually be good rather than that bad, because they allow us to outlet our feelings without using them, without performing the acts really. Still, the problem is that there's no empirical data. There's no empirical data for the cathartic uses, or that performing these acts in a game is more likely to make us do them in the real world. Okay, well, let's consider a third objection, and this one is similar to the other one. What we're going to do is we're going to target the idea that in virtual pedophilia, no one is harmed, but instead of saying that this is going to indirectly harm children, we're going to reject it because we're going to point out that, in fact, when we perform virtual pedophilia, we harm ourselves. So when we play games of that sort, we're harming our own moral character. Probably at this point, you guys have looked at some of the virtue ethics stuff. And so the idea is that we're ruining our own moral character by engaging with games of that sort. Now, you might think, oh, but isn't this symmetric for virtual murder? Aren't you also ruining your character there? Well, the idea is that no, you're not, because very often virtual murder is performed for the competition rather than the kill. So in other words, you're not killing for the sake of killing, you're killing in order to win the game or in order to beat your opponent or something like that. Okay, well, that looks good. The only problem is that we can imagine all sorts of counter instances, and it also looks like the game industry doesn't really run in this way. So think about first the problem of competitive pedophilia. Imagine that there's a video game where the competition is that let's see who molests the most number of children, in order to progress the story, you have to molest a child. Well, here you might say, oh yeah, it's for the competition, not the pedophilic act. But of course, we still kind of think that, hey, that's no good. So competitive pedophilia is a problem, but at the same time, non-competitive murder is also a problem. Because think about, the acts of murder that we find in games, virtual acts of murder. In the game Grand Theft Auto, killing pedestrians on the street doesn't usually advance your score in the game. In fact, it can make things harder for you. And it's not necessary in any case to beat a given mission most of the time. Still, people do it. So it does look like sometimes people murder just for the sake of murdering because it's fun, so to speak. So it looks like that's a second problem. But also, I want you to think about the game industry. If murder isn't, interesting on its own, just for the and it's just for the competition, then you might wonder why in the video game industry we're constantly making video games that are more and more realistic. They depict the murder in a highly realistic fashion. You're not just like shooting them and they fall down and they're bleeding, but also like you blow out a limb or their brain, or you can like chop them up into pieces. Games allow you to do these sorts of things. So it doesn't look like murder is just being performed for the competition. Virtual murder is being performed just for the competition. Okay, well, that argument doesn't look like it works either. So let's consider a fourth argument. Here's a possible difference between the cases. Think about, acts of virtual pedophilia. Well, these acts single out a single group of humans for harm, right? In other words, in virtual murder, it's just directed at everyone, but virtual pedophilia is directed at children in particular. So maybe that's the difference between the cases, that one of them singles out a single group for harm. And singling out a single group for harm is extra bad. Just think about your friend who says, I hate humanity, versus your friend who says, I hate homosexuals, or I hate Jews, or I hate Arabs. We think that there's something a bit worse about the person who says, I hate Jews, or I hate Arabs, or I hate homosexuals. So singling out a particular group is particularly harmful. So maybe the problem with virtual pedophilia is that it singles out children. Well, this looks good as far as it goes, but again, there's problems. First of all, it's not clear to us that it would be good to have indiscriminate killing. Virtual murder is indiscriminate killing. And the question we really want to ask ourselves is indiscriminate killing, much better than singling out a single group? But now, forget that argument, think about this other argument. Imagine that there's a video game, called Universal Molester. In Universal Molester, you play this molester, who goes and molests little children, but also molests adults, but also molests old people, and so on. Well, it's unlikely that we're going to think that Universal Molester is an okay game just because it doesn't single out children. So that doesn't look like it's a good argument either. So let's think about one more argument, and this one's related to the last one. Maybe we think it's not just the fact that we're singling out a single group that's the problem. Maybe it's that children in particular have a special status. Like we think that when we target children, that's extra bad. After all, they're defenseless, they're naive, they don't know much about the world, they're the future human generation, so they particularly matter to us. And maybe that's the difference. Virtual pedophilia targets that group that we count as having a special status. Well, this is an interesting objection. And in fact, all of these cases, there's a bunch of cases that it's worth thinking about. Like think about virtual child murder versus virtual pedophilia. Which of these is more wrong, if either? And what about virtual child murder versus regular murder or adult murder? And what about virtual pedophilia versus adult molestation? So it's worth thinking about all of these cases. But the main problem with this objection is that the harms being compared are distinct and so not clearly comparable. It's not clear that any harm to a child is worse than any harm to an adult, after all. If we think, somebody kills an adult but steals a lollipop from a kid, we think still the killing of the adult is worse. So it's not just like automatically the involvement of children justifies it. So we really have to wonder whether virtual murder is really less harmful than virtual pedophilia. After all, in one case, a person's life is lost. So Morgan Luck concludes that basically none of these arguments work. And since none of them work, we're stuck with the gamer's dilemma. He does say some interesting things at the end of this discussion. He says that, we focused on computer games, on video games, right? But this dilemma can also be adapted to other types of worlds like paintings, films, TV series, and books. So maybe it's not just virtual murder and pedophilia that we find a problem with, but maybe if it happened also in film, in paintings, and books, we'd also find it equally a problem. He also highlights that there's this passive versus active distinction when it comes to video games. Video games are particularly active. They're an interactive form of art. And so you're kind of performing these acts yourself. So maybe there's something going on there. But he's a little bit doubtful about this. He says, well, think about like a cutscene which contains a pedophilic act. Will we be more comfortable with that? Well, it's not clear. What should we think of the gamer's dilemma? Is it something specific to video games, or is it something that has a wider scope? Like, does it apply in movies? Does it apply in TV shows? Is it that we always think that murder is better than pedophilia in any of these media, or is it something that's specific to games? And now I also want you to recall that we talked about two things really, without really pulling them apart. And those are the ideas of virtual and the idea of a game. So a lot of the examples I gave, all the examples I gave were from video games, and video games are both cases where you're performing virtual acts, but also you're performing game acts. So here's the point of this article. What I noticed after a while is that, in fact, the gamer's dilemma, there seems to be a disagreement amongst the participants of the dilemma about how big is this dilemma? Is it something that just applies to video games, or does it apply to a lot of other things as well? And you can have two positions when you find that different participants in the debate are interpreting the dilemma in two different ways. You might think that, oh, they're disagreeing about one dilemma and they're disagreeing about the interpretation of this dilemma. But another possibility is that, in fact, the gamer's dilemma disguises more than one dilemma. And so this is what I came to think, that, in fact, there are three different dilemmas, and all of them are dilemmas that the video gamer faces. The dilemmas aren't all connected to video games, but they're all ones that occur in video games. And I think this is why the gamer's dilemma was run into one dilemma for so long. So let me go back and tell you a little bit about how Morgan Luck introduces the dilemma. So look at the way he writes. This is from the opening of the last article that we read. He says, most people agree that murder is wrong. Yet within computer games, virtual murder rarely scarcely raises an eyebrow. So look at what he's already said here. He says, within computer games, virtual murder. Well, are those the same thing? Is being in a computer game or being in a video game the same as being virtual? And then he goes on, he says, in one respect, this is hardly surprising, as no one is actually murdered within a computer game. So now it looks like the emphasis is on the computer game, right? And then he goes on to say, a virtual murder, some might argue, is no more unethical than taking a pawn in a game of chess. And here he's just started by talking about virtual murder, then he's gone to talking about a game, chess. Anyway, so we could put it briefly by saying that the original premises, as Morgan Luck had envisioned them, say something like this: virtual murder in video games is morally permissible. Virtual pedophilia in video games is morally impermissible, and there are no morally relevant differences between virtual murder and virtual pedophilia in video games. But now you can ask this question. You can say, like, does it matter that it's in a video game? Because notice that being in a video game isn't necessary for everything virtual. Think about some virtual things that aren't in a video game. In Second Life, or in VR chat, or when you're online on Facebook, you're not playing a game, you're just in a virtual world. Not all virtual worlds are game worlds. And similarly, not all game worlds are virtual worlds. After all, you can play a game like Monopoly that's just a board game. You can play a card game. You can even play a game that's purely verbal. So game things and virtual things aren't necessarily intersecting. So now we can ask the following question. We can ask, does it matter for the gamer's dilemma that it's in a video game? Now, assume that the answer you give is yes. Well, then it looks like the issue isn't really about it being virtual murder. It's about it being game murder. Is murder an act that's acceptable within games, right? Game murder. It's not real murder, right? But is it okay for us to play games where, somebody murders somebody else? Or for that matter, where somebody molests somebody else? So let's now distinguish this dilemma, the dilemma that focuses on games, and we can call this the gaming dilemma. And the gaming dilemma is not focused on virtual acts, it's rather focused on game acts, which are acts that are performed in a game. And as I said, gaming acts are not necessarily virtual performances. So the question there that we're really asking in the gaming dilemma is it okay to perform all types of acts in games, or are some acts not permissible? Now, you could have one of two positions. You could just say, of course, in a game, it's just a game, right? So any act is permissible. I can do whatever because I'm just playing, right? I'm just in a game. But you might think that this is not exactly right either, because in fact, when you look at games, you do see that there's a moral question about what's permissible or not permissible in games. So let me give you 4 real-life examples. Think about cheating in a game of Monopoly. You might wonder, is it okay for somebody to cheat in the game of Monopoly, like to steal cards when no one is looking, or to, do any of these number of ways that you can cheat in the game? You would say it's not really cheating. I mean, I'm just cheating in the game. It's not, I'm not cheating in the real world. So is that okay? Or think about, some board games. Many board games have a theme, and the theme is colonialism. So you like invade these people's native country, and then you separate it. I give an example is the game Archipelago. So is a board game about colonialism okay? There's something to ask there, right? Because you might think that that's not okay. Maybe it's kind of like an endorsement of the colonial mindset. Or think about, sex games. You and your partner might decide to play a game with each other. Well, are any sex games that you play fine? Maybe one of you pretends to own the other. Okay, maybe that's okay. Is it okay? What about if one of you pretends to be a child and one of you pretends to be an adult, and one of you, the adult person of you, pretends to molest the child one of you? Is that okay? So again, there's a real question about, are all sex games okay? Just like are all moves in a Monopoly game okay? Just like are all board games okay? Or take a really, I think an example that many of us think is not okay. Think about games that involve fighting, for instance, dog fighting or bullfighting. Is that okay? Is it okay to put an animal at risk in that way, or even, get them killed, right, in order for you to play your game? Well, it doesn't look like it's obviously okay to just say, oh, yeah, but it's just a game. So that's what the gaming dilemma is about. And you can see that it applies to all game instances, not just ones that occur in video games. It also noticeably excludes some virtual instances. For instance, think about a virtual physics simulator. Anything that occurs in that is not a game. So that's not what the gaming dilemma is talking about. Or imagine I use the Unity game engine to construct 2 characters and have one murder the other or one molest the other. Does the gaming dilemma apply to that? Well, not really. That case is virtual, but it's not a game. So this also means that when we solve the gaming dilemma, we're really trying to solve something very specific. We're trying to figure out, well, look, here's the rationale you can have. Gaming and video games in particular are an art form. So, many philosophers think this now, and they think it's an art form of agency. So really, we're asking, is everything permissible in art? That's the general question that we have in mind. And you might think that, yeah, everything is permissible in art. Art's supposed to be free and so on. But that's also not super obvious. For instance, there is a very famous documentary called Triumph of the Will, and it's a documentary that's very beautifully shot. But this documentary is filmed by Hitler's director. And this woman was actually following around Hitler and like glorifying the things that he was doing through her documentary. Her documentary is very beautiful, but many people think that there's something questionable about that documentary because it endorses a bad point of view. It endorses the Nazi point of view. Okay, by contrast, now I want you to think about the things other than the gaming dilemma. When we focus on the virtual context, we get what we would call the virtual dilemma. And this virtual dilemma is a bit different than the gaming dilemma. It's not focused on whether, gaming as an art, can we do things in it? It's actually focused on, are things permissible in virtual worlds? So let's distinguish these cases. Let's call one of them a virtual reproduction of X and one of them a virtual representation of X. And, virtual reproductions of X are a type of X, whereas virtual representations of X are just like a picture of X. They're not really an X. So notice now that if you try to apply the gamer's dilemma to these cases, there is no virtual reproduction dilemma. If you have a virtual reproduction of murder, then that thing would actually be murder. Recently, a virtual reality headset was developed where it has like an apparatus here where if you die, in the game, it'll kill you, So there, the virtual murder is really murder. I think Sword Art Online, this anime, also has something like that going on in it. But in any case, if you think about virtual reproductions of murder and virtual reproductions of pedophilia, well, those are types of murder and types of pedophilia. In fact, we don't think that Gamer's Dilemma applies at all for those cases because we neither think that virtual reproductions of murder are okay, since they're really cases of murder, and we don't think that virtual reproductions of pedophilia are okay, since they're really cases of pedophilia. By contrast, when we turn to the virtual representation dilemma, right, there the question is kind of different, right? Because now what we're really focused on is representations. So let's call this one the representational dilemma. And the representational dilemma is asking, what's okay to represent? Like, can I represent people cheering at the murder of someone? Can I represent murder? Can I represent pedophilia? Can I represent molestation? Can I do it no matter how detailed I do it? Whether I do it in a book, that's a form of representation. So I represent it verbally through words, or I represent it in a TV show, or I represent it through a movie, or I represent it in a game, or I represent it in the virtual world. That's the representational dilemma. And notice that this dilemma has really wide scope. It applies to all the representational cases. What we're really asking there is the question, are virtual representations of murder okay, but virtual representations of pedophilia not okay? Or are they both okay or neither okay? So this dilemma is solved by figuring out what's okay to represent. It's like it's talking about pictures of things, not about things themselves. By contrast, so remember, I said, you can reproduce all the features of X, and that would be a reproduction of X, and there's no dilemma. But imagine you did something less than that. Imagine that instead of reproducing all the features of, say, a calculator, you reproduce only some of them. Like you just make this virtual calculator add, but it doesn't multiply, subtract, or divide. In general, we can reproduce something partially. So let's call a partial reproduction of something a simulation of that thing. So we can now talk about virtual reproductions of calculators, virtual simulations of calculators, and virtual representations of calculators. We've already spoken about the virtual representation dilemma, but notice that there's a virtual simulation dilemma. So the simulation dilemma has narrower scope than the representational dilemma because it only applies to cases where you simulate something. Now, most simulations do happen in the virtual world, but again, not all of them do. Think about if you've watched the show Westworld, so just pretend like we're on the first episode, don't think of the later things that happen. Westworld is a non-virtual world where there are like artificial robot characters who you can do various things to. But they're obviously not real lives, at least in the first episode, because they can't really die, for instance, and they don't really have feelings. So, in fact, the simulation dilemma applies to Westworld. We can say, is it okay to build a world like Westworld? Is murder in Westworld okay? Is pedophilia in Westworld okay? Um, or if you want another example, think about Jurassic Park. Jurassic Park is also not virtual, but in some sense, it's simulated. The animals in it have been like artificially generated, they can't reproduce, and so on. So now you might wonder the same things about Jurassic Park. What's okay in Jurassic Park? The simulation dilemma applies to these things. Of course, it applies to also many virtual cases. So, even in games, there are simulations, right? So think about Grand Theft Auto. Sometimes you don't have to play the game, you just kind of wander around the world doing whatever you want. So that looks like it's a virtual reproduction of, or at least a partial virtual reproduction of walking around in a city, of committing crimes, and so on. So that actually points out something interesting, which is that these dilemmas intersect at certain points. It's not like they're completely distinct from one another. Nevertheless, they it's not like they completely don't overlap with one another. Nevertheless, they are distinct dilemmas. One of them is asking, is it okay, to perform certain sorts of game acts? Another is saying, is it okay to represent certain sorts of acts? And a third is asking, is it okay to simulate certain sorts of acts? Okay, in the original article, I talk about some of the positions in the debate and how they've been speaking past each other because they're focused on different dilemmas. But instead of doing that here, let's talk about the arguments that Morgan Luck had considered earlier and see what dilemmas they apply to, because that will be kind of informative. So think about the social acceptability argument he gave, where he says, pedophilia is less socially acceptable. Well, this solution would actually apply to all of the dilemmas, since, whether you're representing pedophilia, simulating pedophilia, or having game pedophilia, there would still be the social acceptability component. But of course, we saw that that argument doesn't work very well. Or now think about the significant likelihoods case. Well, most probably the significant likelihoods case applies to the simulation dilemma. So there, the idea was that if you, perform this act in the virtual world, you're going to be more likely to perform it in the real world. It doesn't seem likely that what we're saying is that if you play games that are about murder, you're going to commit more murders. It also doesn't seem like if you represent murder, if you do drawings of murder, for instance, you're more likely to murder. More likely, we mean that if you kind of do acts that are kind of similar to murder, like you simulate murder, then maybe you are more likely to commit murder. So maybe that dilemma, the significant likelihoods dilemma, applies mainly to the simulation dilemma. Think about now argument 3, where we talked about the competition rather than the kill. So there, the idea was that virtual murder is not about, when we commit these murders in a game, it's actually just so that we can win the game. And we saw, or like to beat the competition or something like that. Well, notice that this dilemma clearly applies to the gaming dilemma. It doesn't necessarily apply to, representations or to simulations. After all, representations and simulations, there's no such thing as winning them, right? There's no competition there. In a virtual online social world, if I'm in VR chat, I can't win VR chat. In general, I can't win chat programs at all. What I can win is games. So that argument looks like it's focused on the gaming dilemma. Think about now the last two arguments where you're unfairly singling out a group for harm and the special status of children. Well, like the social acceptability dilemma, that seems to apply across the board to all three dilemmas. And this is because in all of them, whether I single out in my representations, whether I single out in my simulations, or I single out in my games, then maybe there's something problematic about that. Still, that singling out in all of these three cases is doing something different in each case. Similarly, if I think children have a special status, then maybe I think that children shouldn't feature in games, they shouldn't feature in representations, and they shouldn't feature in simulations. But notice that these are differently plausible. So you might think that, there's actually more of a case to be made in the simulation case, less of a case to be made in, for instance, the normal representation case. It seems like we can have like represented children in TV shows or something like that, but maybe we don't want to simulate acts, where children, have some violent thing happen to them. Okay, so I hope that this is not a solution to the gamer's dilemma, but clarifying that there are three dilemmas helps us to think about the problem more clearly.